Welcome back. We are now ready for our next session for the day. Taking the discussion on tackling match fixing forward from the presentation, we now have a panel discussion on does India need a match fixing legislation? Our panelists are Ms. Rebecca John, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, who represented Indian cricketer S. Sreesanth in the IPL spot fixing case, Mr. Stephen Richardson, Coordinator of Investigations, ICC Anti-Corruption Unit, Mr. Pradeep Magazine, journalist and author of the book, Not Quite Cricket, The Explosive Story of How Bookmakers Influence the Game Today, and the moderator of the session, Mr. Suhrith Parthasarathy, advocate, Madras High Court, and author of several articles in leading publications such as Live Mint and The Hindu on tackling match fixing in India. If you do have any questions during this session, please do type in your questions in the Q&A box below, and our panelists will try to answer some of them. Over to Suhrith and the panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great privilege to be a part of the Sports Law and Policy Symposium 2020. Let me begin by welcoming our distinguished panel of guests, Mr. Steve Richardson, Ms. Rebecca John, and Mr. Pradeep Magazine. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
The French philosopher Roger Caillois described games as an attempt to substitute ideal conditions for the normal confusion of everyday life. In other words, it constituted, according to him, what we today like to describe as an escape, as an alternate stream of events that is still tailored somehow to the realities of our existence. But many theorists have seen games in their modern form, especially with the advent of spectator sports, as having shifted towards over-seriousness. They say that there's been a movement away from the inherent and original values of participation. But whether we see all of this in and of itself as a form of corruption or not, as the American moralist and social critic Christopher Lasch has shown us, what we all know for certain is that sport matters. It matters to us all. It's a part of the everyday fabric of our lives. And as a fan of sports, there can be few things that I think that can breach the trust that we impose on it, more than the idea that the events of a match, the events of a game have been prefixed, that players have accepted gifts, cash to throw a match. I mean, we see this as cheating, as something inherently antithetical to the moral purport of sport. But in choosing these words, breach of trust, cheating, etc., I mean, these are words that have distinct connotations in the law. But we are not necessarily referring to them in terms of the law at all. We are using them to express our sort of moral indignation at these practices. So over the course of this session, what we'll try and do is to get the panel's thoughts on how this indignation ought to be expressed in terms of a country's justice delivery system. Does it at all need addressing by the law? Is sport so inextricably linked with other commercial activities that there is no choice but to extend the long arm of the country's laws to its sphere of activities? Now, if we do need it to do so, do the laws that we already have on our books suffice? If not, what kind of law is needed for this purpose? Should it merely be in the realm of civil legislation, or should criminal sanctions be imposed in the form of fines and imprisonment? We'll also try and see how other jurisdictions might have reacted to these problems. There are, of course, certain attendant issues too in India, not least the status of gambling and its legal regulation in India. So without further ado, let me try and get the discussion started. I want to begin with Mr. Pradeep Magazine. Can you tell us, Mr. Magazine, a little bit about how you feel and how most fans might feel about fixing in sports? Is it seen as something that requires legal sanctions? I mean, how do fans look at it in your reading? Do they intrinsically believe that a player who has cheated them, so to speak, needs to be sanctioned by the law, quite apart from facing other forms of punishment? Now, you yourself have said that cricket hasn't been the same for you since revelations around fixing first began to emanate. So how do you see this as a journalist?
Well, as a journalist, as a cricket fan,
I think we've just lost our connection with Mr. Magazine. So but I'm also sort of delighted to see that Mr. Ajit Singh has joined us. Welcome, sir, to the session. So I think I'll just sort of, we can get back to Mr. Magazine once he's back online. But maybe Mr. Singh, I'll begin with you. I mean, in India, what is clear is that the existing legal structure, at least from the point of view of the criminal law, appears to be inadequate. I mean, nothing possibly exemplifies this better than the cases against Srishant and the others, who were tried under the draconian Maharashtra Control of Organized Crimes Act of 1999. And we all know that in 2015, a district court in Delhi discharged all of these persons who were charged of both under the Makoka and also charges of cheating under the IPC, and they were discharged from both of these charges. So one of the things that the Delhi court pointed out was the absence of a specific law, it's very difficult to prosecute these individuals. So do you therefore think that we need a special law? And if so, what must such a law try to do? Should it impose criminal sanctions?
Look, as far as the adequacy of the law goes, it's been debated for a long time, and the government itself in 2013 put up a draft legislation for comments. So the government, it shows the intent of the government. The court judgments clearly say that there is no adequate law to cover match fixing. CBI in its report has said that, well, there's no law to cover the match fixing. And after a preliminary inquiry where it found evidence against a few players and others of match fixing, it refused to register a case because it said there's no adequate legal framework to proceed on in this matter. So definitely there's a requirement for a law, and a law which criminalizes the match fixing. Now, it needs to be a regulatory law, and if you don't criminalize it, well, the situation is what it is right now. If anybody has to go to a civil court, he can still go. But in a civil matter, I'm sure there'd be huge problems in terms of you may be able to fix who the offenders are but who's going to be the claimant? If you say, well, it's the team management or team owner who would be a claimant for damages against the person who's been involved in match fixing, well, that could be a possibility. But then there could be a scenario where team management and the team ownership could be in collusion with the fixers. They may be asking the people to fix. Now, here who would be the claimant? Further, if I, as a fan, buy a ticket and go and see a match, and then I'm told that the match was fixed, well, I'm the one who's been cheated, who's been damaged. So if the fans or spectators go in for claims, you're opening a Pandora's box. I hope that we don't come to that stage, but I think the way out is legalizing it. Again, if it's a civil matter, there'll be an issue of court fees. There are states which charge ad valorem court fees. So if there's a big claim, where does one deposit those court fees from?
Right. So Mr. Singh has made a number of points here, and I'd like to bring Ms. Rebecca John in here. I mean, I think Mr. Magazine is back with us, but if I can just get Ms. Rebecca John to react to this, because and then come back to Mr. Magazine. Ms. John, you're a senior advocate and a practitioner of criminal law. So I'm trying to understand here, sort of from a point of view, from a more jurisprudential point of view. I mean, what is it that makes something a crime? Or rather, what is it that ought to make something a crime? Is something like fixing a sporting contest an act of stupendous immorality that demands criminal prosecution? And if it is, how much must we be concerned with the kind of burden that this might place on what some might describe as an already flailing criminal justice system?
So there are many questions there. Let me say, as a criminal lawyer, I know nothing about the sport, but as a criminal lawyer who represented a cricketer who was being prosecuted for match fixing, my concerns are the following. Ethics, morality have nothing to do with law, and certainly nothing to do with criminal law. When you identify a crime and you define a crime and you make a section which prosecutes that crime, then the ingredients of the offense must be fulfilled before the prosecution can be launched, and if at all it is going to be successful. Criminal law as it stands in our statute books at the moment, when you look at either the IPC or MACOCA, which was remarkably imposed in this case by the Delhi police, it became that much more difficult for them to even prove the first elements of the so-called crime. And that is the problem. You can talk of going to civil courts, court fee, these are all practical things. But when you go to when you attack criminal jurisprudence and you want people to face a criminal trial for a criminal charge, it has to be determined what is the nature of offense. Has the state fulfilled the ingredients of the offense that you're charging the person with? And if you haven't done it, then you'll see the same kind of mishmash that you saw in Srishant's case. And in all the subsequent cases, as we speak, you are aware of the fact that a bookie has been released on bail by the Delhi High Court. And again, the Delhi High Court said, what is this, 15 years it's taken from the time that the FIR was launched. You spent 5 years trying to extradite the man from England to India. At the end of it, you have nothing but very, very slim evidence, peripheral evidence, which really doesn't fulfill the requirements of criminal law. As a criminal lawyer, and aside from this discussion, I have problems with over-criminalizing human activity. I have problems with over-sentencing. In a country which is struggling with its criminal justice system, in a country where a rape victim finds it very difficult to file a criminal complaint with the police station, much less pursue the matter in a court of law, in a country where you are overwhelmed with criminal cases, in a country where the Supreme Court has time and again said that regulatory bodies must do their job, I don't understand why you need to criminalize events like these. What is the regulatory body doing? Let me give you a parallel. In the case of the Medical Council of India, the Supreme Court, in a landmark judgment called Jacob Matthew versus State, said the first job, even if it is culpable negligence, the first job is for the Medical Council to determine whether at all it is culpable negligence or not before the police registers an FIR, because we don't want to enter into space where we are not experts. Likewise, what are regulatory bodies doing in the case of cricket or any other sport? It is their principal failure, and you can't shift their failure to monitor to the criminal justice system and say, now the state prosecutes. So I have great difficulty in accepting that prosecution, and that to criminal prosecution, is the way forward. I think it's a disaster which will ultimately fail, as you have seen in the few cases that have attained some prominence and notoriety in this country. Prosecutions have consistently failed because you have not been able to prove either the ingredients of the offense or the culpability of the individual. Your evidence is so slim, it's so peripheral. So I don't understand what we are talking about.
Mr. Richardson, I'm going to sort of bring you in just shortly to respond to some of what Ms. John and Mr. Singh have just mentioned. But if I can just go to Mr. Magazine first and then come to you. And Mr. Magazine, I go back to the original question that I raised with you in terms of how people, as in sort of how fans view fixing. Do they see it as something that requires criminalizing, that requires sort of legal sanctions being imposed? And the reason why I ask this is, as Ms. Rebecca John was mentioning, once you treat something as a crime, it no doubt goes beyond the realm of ethics, morality, etc., and it comes to the sort of four corners of the law itself. But in deciding what ought to constitute a crime, some of these factors might play a role or might make a difference, at least in the minds of the legislators. So I'm keen to understand from you how you view it and how you think fans see sort of the very idea of fixing a match.
Is this question for me?
Yes, sir, it's for you.
Sorry, I have having problems with the link, so I missed out a lot of things which were probably said earlier. Look, the fans trust the game. From a fan's perspective, a crime committed by a player by cheating him, by manipulating the odds, by prefixing the result of the game, I think is an offense which he is not willing to forgive. Not that his willingness or unwillingness should have any impact on the judicial part of it, but he feels that, look, he trusts that unlike, say, politicians or businessmen or various other stakeholders in our society, sportspersons are clean, they are role models, and when he sees them cheat, he feels devastated. I think you ask any fan, he will say in anger that these players should be hanged. So from a that perspective, it's a crime which he may be willing to forgive many other crimes of other people having committed. He feels badly let down.
Right. Mr. Steve Richardson, let me sort of bring you in here and try and get you to react to what's been said earlier. I mean, how much does this entire issue depend on persons outside the sport? Because there are obviously strict codes of conduct that you can impose through the ICC and through the domestic boards. But the issue, I suppose, at least partly, concerns itself not with the players themselves, but with those who are doing the actual fixing, who are trying to beat whatever system it is, whether it is legalized gambling or illegal gambling. I mean, we saw, for example, in the cases of the three Pakistani cricketers, Mohammad Asif, Salman Butt, and Mohammad Amir, when they were tried in the UK, it was under the Gambling Act, and that was the legislation that was involved. But this law obviously could be used to try others too, and that I suppose proved critical. So I want to pose two questions to you. Now, do you think that the systems in place within the ICC already are strong enough to deal with players? And if so, whether that will suffice insofar as the sanctioning of the players are concerned? And secondly, can you talk a little bit from your own experience in dealing with persons who might have tried to or who've influenced players and who've gone unpunished for this because you lack the powers to deal with them? So I just want to kind of get a perspective on why a law might be needed from the point of view of, in terms of the limitations of an ICC-led or a board-led investigation into these activities.
Well, certainly from the ICC's perspective, we have a robust anti-corruption code that enables us to take action against players, coaches, and other participants within the sport who are engaged in match fixing. That's stood the test of time, and it's actually governed by English civil law, which is a decision made by the members of the ICC. And it's been tested on a number of occasions, including through the Court of Arbitration in Sport, based in Switzerland, which for us is the final arbiter and the final appeal for any decisions that we make. In terms of other jurisdictions and prosecuting offences, you mentioned the three Pakistan players back in 2010. They were actually prosecuted under the 1906 Corruption Act in the UK, which has now been superseded by the Bribery Act. And the Bribery Act is not specifically aimed at sports corruption, but it was used to prosecute three individuals, including another player, Nasir Jamshed, just before Christmas in the UK, and three people pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit match fixing and bribe offences under the Bribery Act. So legislation can be effective. Now, I see this from a slightly different perspective. in as much as I do not see the players as the main problem when it comes to match fixing. The players are the final link in the chain who actually would go out onto the pitch and perform any act if they had agreed to do so. The problem as I see it is further upstream, and it's in the people who are organising the corruption, the people who are paying the players for money, and most of those sit outside the sport. And I could actually deliver to the Indian police or the Indian government now at least 8 names of people who are what I would term serial offenders, constantly approaching players to try and get them to fix in matches. And at the moment, with a lack of legislative framework in India, it's very limited what the police can do. And to that extent, they have my great sympathy, because they try as professionally and hard as they can to actually make the existing legislation work. But the reality is it wasn't framed with sports corruption in mind. So the reason that there is an imperative for legislation specific to match fixing, yes, it is about the players, but more importantly, it's about those outside the sport who actually corrupt the players and are organising and pulling the strings of these networks. Those are the people that I would like to see dealt with under match fixing law. And it's happened in other jurisdictions. You may be aware that late last year, Sri Lanka was the first in the region to introduce match fixing legislation, to the great credit of the sports minister, Haran Fernando. He brought that to Parliament just before Parliament dissolved and got it through. For that reason, cricket and sport in Sri Lanka is better protected today than it was this time last year.
Right. Mr. Ajit Singh, if I can bring you back here. I mean, you spoke earlier about why you believe that there is a need for a legislation of this sort, a sort of an umbrella legislation that would deal with fixing in sports. But in light of what Mr. Richardson has just told us about people outside the net of the game, and he pointed to some lacunae possibly in the laws in India in terms of whether that's sufficient to deal with these people outside the game who are actually trying to do the fixing. But I want to kind of try and understand from you in terms of your own experience, and you've had a fair stint now as the anti-corruption head of the BCCI, and you would have filed FIRs yourself and invoked the law yourself. I mean, how has that experience been? And do you see any specific holes in the law that need addressing? And I'm talking here not so much about the players themselves, because I mean, even if we were to kind of assume or take it for a moment that the players can be dealt with by the respective boards and by the ICC, but about these others who are approaching the players, who are possibly doing the fixing. I mean, what is it that you see as a serious lacuna in the law?
Look, as an anti-corruption agency, there is little we can do to non-participants. Participants would cover players, officials, and all those involved. It's a wide definition in the anti-corruption code. But the entire malaise emanates from betting. Betting is a crime in India. Now, just to make windfall gains illegally in an illegal way through betting, they approach the participants. It could be a player, it could be a curator, it could be a match official, whoever. And the amounts of money involved are unimaginable. I don't know, that nobody can vouch for it, but then there are surveys which say annual turnover in betting in India is about 30 to 40,000 crores. This involves sports plus others. But there are certain state league matches on which through agencies like Sports Radar and other agencies, we got certain the betting examined on certain matches, and it's not the IPL or something, it's the state league, and it comes to the tune of maybe 2, 3, 4, 2.4 million, 5 million, 20 million euros or pounds. So the amount of betting on small matches is so much that the temptation to fall prey to the demands of or the requests of these people is very high. And it's more so with people who don't see much of a future for themselves. And then what has started is now cricket is played in rural areas, in Mufassil towns. And there certain godfathers have come to finance that. They see a promising player, they finance the player, to become his patron. And ultimately what happens is when he's at a level where his games are televised, where he's made it to a certain league, then they extract the pound of flesh. So it's a thing where people, the fans, put in a huge amount of emotional, they invest a lot emotionally in the game, whichever game it is. And when a thing like this happens and the corruption starts from the early stages, it's a sort of a very organized thing where those people who are into betting, they weren't into sports betting earlier, but they've come into sports betting, and then they nurture these players, and ultimately when they reach a certain level, they start using them for spot fixing, whatever. So it's something which needs to be curbed, and it needs to be curbed heavily in the sense, both at the match fixing level and the betting level. We need to make a very strong law against betting. Right now, the law that exists is totally archaic, and the punishments in it are laughable. You impose a fine of 200 rupees, 500 rupees, and that's the end of it.
I mean, I'll come back to you, sir, on the larger issue of betting in India and in terms of the regulation of betting in India. But let me go to Ms. Rebecca John now and ask her a little bit more in terms, I mean, some of what she touched upon earlier in terms of evidence gathering in cases such as this. Now, I mean, of course, you represented Srishant, but I also want to know more generally, I mean, how much of issues concerning match fixing is also linked to the way sports bodies perhaps function in India. I mean, it's all well perhaps to say that we can have a special law for match fixing, but we still don't have a special law to regulate many of these bodies. I mean, many of these sports bodies. So do you think that ideally issues such as this, such as match fixing, if at all it needed to be brought under the sort of legal lens, if at all it needed to be criminalized, that it needs to come under the larger umbrella law that deals with regulation of sports as a whole? And yeah, I mean, I also want you to comment briefly on the interplay between the criminal justice system, the burden of proof there, and the proof within these organizations. Because in the absence of one umbrella law, I think that is a problem that we might face in terms of how cases such as this are in fact proven.
So the case that I dealt with in some detail was the IPL case of 2013. But I have also had occasion to read the judgment of the Andhra High Court in Azharuddin's case, as well as the judgment of the Supreme Court, the civil judgment of the Supreme Court in Srishant's case. As far as a criminal case was concerned, you know, you make this magical structure, superstructure. There are these people sitting in some foreign country. They are part of the crime syndicate. You invoke Makoka because they are they're continuously involved in illegal activity, and they have been involved in 2 or 3 charge sheets in the past 10 years. So you invoke Makoka as far as those people who you have not seen, against whom you have no evidence, but they are these people sitting in some corner, and you can just assume that they remain there. And then you seek to connect them with Indian agents, sub-agents, sub-agents, and finally to someone close to the player and the player himself. So this was a long, complicated chart which was presented before the court. And the court looked at it and said, there was no direct evidence against the player because there was no direct conversation. There was nothing connecting him saying that, I have asked for this money, give it to me. If that was there, perhaps the case was different. So there was nothing connected, which was directly connecting the player, but some people who knew him vaguely, who were negotiating, so to speak, on his behalf. Then the question arose, was it with consent? Did the player even know that somebody was negotiating on his behalf? And then how do you connect the dots and reach to the crime syndicate? Now, all of that drew a blank. There was nothing at all. So you had a bunch of conversations, sometimes disconnected. One wasn't leading to another. In fact, some of those conversations, when we examined it in detail, were actually in favor of the player, because the player was saying, I don't want to get involved with this. I'm at the stage of my career where I just don't want to get involved with this. So it was not incriminating in any way. So the judge actually asked the special cell of the Delhi police, what is your case? How do I make these assumptions? How are these dots going to be connected? And naturally, it had to fall it had to crumble, and that is what happened. So I think in all of these cases, unless there is some agency which is tracking the link between X to Y to Z to Z1 to Z2, there will be many people who will fall between the cracks. And that's what happened in the case that I dealt with. Now, coming to other issues, although I'm no expert on cricket or cricketing bodies, and my knowledge is fairly peripheral, it kind of amuses me, and I make no personal comment against anybody, that sports bodies in India generally seems to be generally fiefdoms, right? People are selected to these bodies because of their connections with other people, etc., etc. So, I mean, I find this high moral ground sometimes, which is taken by sports regulatory bodies, also a little funny, because questions can be asked about how do these people come to exercise power and control over players? What is the level of corruption that exists inside sports bodies? So, so you can expand the question even further. So the people sitting in judgment are themselves sometimes complicit. So what was being said just now by Mr. Ajit Singh, that there are so many people who are outside the purview of the regulatory body, whom we can't control. So if you are going to bring in a law, you must ensure, and I'm very, very skeptical about any law, but be that as it may, you must ensure that you are able, the long arm of the law reaches the right people. The people who start this, who are sending down instructions, who have the money, who are sending down the money through their various channels. And then if it connects to the player, I suppose it can be argued that, if such a legislation and such an investigation were to take place and it comes within the four corners of the definition that you propose to make, there may be a case. As it exists, I don't see how this can go forward. It's a waste of time because you just do not have the evidentiary backup to sustain a case, nor does the police have enough material to connect the entire chain of dots.
I wanted to go to Mr. Magazine, but Mr. Ajit Singh wants to respond to this specific point. So let me just get him to respond to that before I move to Mr. Magazine.
No, I was just saying that there's no excuse for poor investigation. If you don't have the evidence, obviously the case is going to fall flat. And as a part of the proposed law, one would like there to be a specialized investigating agency which keeps a proper database, which can join the dots, which when it sees something, there's an alert raised on its screen that, well, this could be suspicious, and it could investigate. So it's also the law is to facilitate better investigation and better appreciation of what evidence can be collected and what evidence is available. That's what I wanted to say.
Can I just for a minute, just respond to this? You see, suspicion in criminal law does not take the place of proof. You may suspect You may have some material which causes suspicion, but even to cross the stage of framing of charges, the law is it has to be grave suspicion and not suspicion. So the challenge really is the quality of evidence you have. And inevitably, that is of a very, very poor quality. So you may be suspicious of certain activities. And that's why I'm saying perhaps regulatory bodies may be better equipped to deal with it than sending it to police agencies, which are trained to look at it very differently.
Mr. Magazine, if I may just sort of, we've been speaking quite a bit about laws here and how they can perhaps potentially help clean up a few things. I mean, but we all know that laws are rarely a panacea in the sense that, I mean, as much as it might help in cleaning up certain specific aspects, I mean, do you think that therefore that we need something more fundamental to change in the very way in which we look at sport and the way we look at sports administration in our country? I mean, I'm trying to understand from you in terms of the integrity of sport as a whole, how much you think a law on match fixing might contribute towards the restoration, or let's say towards the upkeep of that integrity. Mr. Magazine, that question was for you, which is...
Yeah, I couldn't hear the question complete because the link went off. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, what I'm trying to get at is, I mean, we all know that laws are rarely a panacea in the sense that there are certain things that it can do, there are certain other things that it can't do. So what I want to understand from you is, as someone who's watched the game closely, who's written about it, do you think there's something more fundamental that's needed in order to change the way in which we look at sport in India, the way in which we look at sports administration itself? I mean, and how much you think and you believe that a law on match fixing might help towards the upkeep of the integrity of the sport as a whole? I mean, where does it fall within this sort of larger structure?
Well, I think what Rebecca said, I kind of agree with her on a lot of points. Over the years, my experience of covering cricket from 70s to now has been that the administrators themselves are not above board. They are themselves, and it has been found so many times, be it the 2013 betting scandal in IPL. How did we get to the case? Because one of the owners was involved in betting. Similarly, in 2000, the entire cricketing establishment, especially in India, was in a denial mode. Despite evidences telling them that, look, these things are happening, they were saying, no, it can't happen. Why? So we have to be realistic in what can be done and what cannot be done. I think self-regulation, regulatory bodies, I think ICC's anti-corruption unit, because match fixing is something which goes by the circumstantial evidence of, look, the player has done this, and even taken what the regulatory bodies need to look at is, first they should examine themselves. Are they being true to themselves and true to the game? Secondly, at what level and why do players get tempted? After all, there are outsiders who are tempting the players. As Richardson rightly, I think, said, the problem is when people from outside influence young, impressionable minds. A lot of them don't get as much money, give them contracts for endorsement. Like this man may one day, 5 years later or 6 years later, play for India. So he's already on their payrolls. And I am privy to a number of players who actually got in touch, or a bookmaker got in touch with them, and they were playing in local leagues at a very junior level. So how do we deal with this? I think this is a challenge which probably, even if you make a law, even if you say give harshest of punishment, it will be very difficult to not only prove it, but to control it unless there are certain regulatory mechanisms right from grassroots level to the top which are put in place.
Mr. Richardson, I want to get a comparative perspective from you. I mean, you mentioned the recent example of Sri Lanka. And I also want to kind of try and understand from you how you see, in terms of how it's dealt with in different countries, where in certain jurisdictions gambling is legal, whereas in India it's largely illegal. I mean, and what sort of difference that makes towards the enforcement of a match fixing legislation? I mean, and does it actually sort of practically have an impact on the regulation of match fixing itself, and how it works in different countries from your experience?
So I think the main difference is the way that betting is seen in different countries. I mean, in India, it's illegal, and it's seen as something that is a bad thing. There's an awful lot of other places in the world that we work in where it's legal and it's regulated, and it's not seen as a bad thing. Not everybody is in favor of it, but nevertheless, it is a lawful activity. And we have to be very, very clear here that betting itself is not corruption. So what is corruption is people who are trying to get to players to corrupt them in order to make money from betting. So I come across professional gamblers, people who gamble on sport for a living, and in order to read a match and make money from their expertise, they need that match to be clean. Because if the match is not clean, and if there's something that has been rigged in the match, their expertise and all the models that they use to read a match will not work. So they need the match to be clean. That's one of the first points I would make. I think it's, as far as the legislation is concerned, it's quite an anomaly that you could bet 500 rupees on the outcome of a match for a side to win or lose in India, and that would be illegal. However, if you offered $30,000 to a player to underperform in that match, then there's nothing illegal in that. And just to move on to a couple of the other points that were made, the ICC anti-corruption unit is operationally independent. And I've been doing this within sport, both in England and for the ICC now for 7 years. And at no time has anybody ever tried to influence any investigation, stop me from undertaking an investigation. And my boss, Mr. Alex Marshall, is a former very senior police officer in the UK, very experienced, and he would guard his operational independence with ferocity. I know that he would do that. Now, many of the investigators who are involved in sports corruption investigations, including in cricket, are former detectives within police forces across the world. They're very experienced at investigations. And in actual fact, the principles are the same, whether you're investigating international drug dealing, as I used to do, or whether you're investigating match fixing within cricket, within a sport. The principles are the same. Sometimes you will only get people near the bottom of the food chain, so to speak. At other times, you have the ability to move up the chain, gather the evidence, and take out some of the top people as well. But I think it's recognized internationally within law enforcement that the way you actually deal with a problem is not so much by focusing on the people at the bottom, it's by taking out the more senior people, the organizers, the people who are putting the money up. Sometimes these chains are very, very small. They're people who are involved in betting, who take an opportunity to corrupt a player, offer them money. And if a player takes it, then obviously the player is culpable, and we can and will deal with that. But it's the people outside the sport who are responsible, as I've already said. If you look at legislation in Australia, very, very strong indeed. In Australia, of course, and New Zealand, they've got a number of ICC events that are coming up over the course of the next 18 months, 2 years. And we've worked very, very closely with law enforcement in Australia, and the cooperation between the ICC and Australian law enforcement has been second to none. India has also got 2 ICC global events coming up, the T20 World Cup and also, of course, the World Cup in 2023. And at the moment, with no legislation in place, we will have good relationships with the Indian police, but they are operating with one hand tied behind their back. We will do everything we can to disrupt the corruptors, and we do. We make life very, very difficult for them as far and as much as we can to stop them from operating freely. But legislation would be a game changer in India. We have currently just under 50 investigations that we're undertaking. The majority of those have links back to corruptors in India, the majority of them. So it would be the single most effective thing to happen in terms of protecting sport if India introduced match fixing legislation. Other countries around the world are looking at doing it. It's starting to move in that direction, including countries in your region.
Right. I mean, you made a couple of fascinating points, and I want to get both Mr. Ajit Singh's and Ms. Rebecca John's response to that, which is that when you're fixing a match, and let's say it's a country where betting is legal, then what you're essentially doing is you're cheating two systems. You're cheating, one, the sort of active, or the placement of bets, and in terms of the system of gambling itself, which is the legalized system of gambling, and you're also sort of cheating match goers, etc. So there are two sort of separate elements of cheating that might be involved there. And I'm using the word cheating here very loosely in a colloquial sense and not necessarily in the sense in which it might be used in the law. But in a country like India's, where betting is illegal, the system that is being cheated potentially, I mean, apart from the cheating that's happening at the level of the games itself, is a system which is not otherwise lawful. So I'm wondering, therefore, and what Mr. Singh and Ms. John have to say in response to this, in terms of whether the legalizing of gambling might, sort of help in negating match fixing to a certain extent, and whether you think that this might make a difference at all, one. And second, also whether, given that gambling is already illegal, should we at all be taking the cheating of such a system as seriously by, framing a separate law for that purpose? And I know some of that has already been answered by you previously, but I want to get your thoughts more broadly on the legalizing of gambling and whether that you think might make a difference before we open it up for sort of questions from the audience. Either one of you, I mean, if Mr. Singh, if you'd like to go first, I can put it to you.
Look, as far as legalizing or keeping it as it is, it's a political decision that whoever is scared, that needs to be taken. But if you legalize it, what happens is the enforcement agencies have access to the data of betting. And over-the-board betting also would have its own watchdogs, in the sense they'd like to see where corruption or suspicious betting is going on and raise an alarm if such a thing is happening. So to that extent, that will help the enforcement agencies. But having said that, having legalized betting, I still fear that in India, a lot of illegal betting will continue going on. So you'll have two parallel channels running then. One channel may be helping us, and ultimately all the bets through the illegal channels also come to the legal channels. Through 1, 2, 3, 4 stages, somebody goes and ultimately now places a bet with Betfair or legal channel outside India. And it is from those legal channels that we still get alerts a lot of time. So it's something which, as far as collection of data, raising of alerts, it would be helpful, definitely, for the enforcement agencies.
Ms. John?
Yeah, so coming to betting, the only law we have at the moment is an archaic legacy of our colonial times, the Public Gambling Act of 1867. If you want to legalize betting in the first instance, you have to look at this act and look at the very, very innocent definitions of gambling in this, because obviously things have changed from 1867 to now, and the Act doesn't really take into account even even the minor allegations of betting that take place in the country. Now, again, I think the problem is one of locating the offense. You see, we can sit and talk about all of this. What do you consider an offense? And once you locate the offense, obviously, as Mr. Steve Richardson said, some betting is perfectly fine. I mean, what is wrong if you place a bet on a match, on the outcome of the bet based on your expertise? On the other hand, if you are trying to influence the outcome of a match by going to players and other peripheral actors, then of course it is a crime. So I think we need to locate what is the crime and then move forward. Simply saying, let's legalize betting, let's amend the Public Gambling Act of 1867 is not going to take us anywhere. Locate the offense, locate the chain of offenders, and then move forward if you want to bring in a legislation.
We have about 20 minutes left, and there seem to be quite a few questions in the Q&A box. So I'll move to that, and I can sort of read from those and then place it to the panel as a whole, and whichever one of you is comfortable answering it. And if there are questions sort of specifically addressed to one of you, I'll point it out as well. The first question is from Atul, and he says the very definition of a crime requires a causation which directly causes a harm to a person or a thing. In the case of a privately organized tournament, say the IPL or the NBA, isn't this breach just a breach of its own private fair play policy or private contract or trust? How does such a private breach of trust amount to a criminal offense, even with a liberal interpretation? And how does the well-established jurisprudence of standard of crimes apply in this case? Ms. Rebecca, John, if you could address this, and I can also get Mr. Ajit Singh to respond to it.
Very, very valid question. Very, very valid question. What is the BCCI at the end of the day? Is it a governmental organization? How do you invoke charges of corruption? So to negotiate through this is extremely critical. You say you played for India. You're actually playing for the BCCI. What is playing for India? So how does a state come into it? These are very, very, very interesting questions that we need to negotiate. Secondly, as he very correctly said, standards and standards of proof and are so high. Now, presently, you have the Prevention of Corruption Act, which applies to public servants and anybody who is abetting a public servant. Do you have a Private Bribery Act in this country? You don't, where private individuals can also be prosecuted for bribery. We don't have that structure. So really, I think the question is valid. I think you have to look at a much broader structure. And I would like to repeat what I said earlier. Locate that structure, locate the crime, and locate the offenders. Otherwise, in this particular case, it can be argued, who is the BCCI at the end of the day? And who has been cheated? To use it very, very colloquially, who has been cheated? What is the crime? So I think these are serious issues, and I agree with it.
Mr. Ajit Singh, would you like to say anything to that? Because you had made the point earlier about how spectators, when they go to the ground, they feel sort of this sense of their trust having been breached.
Breach of trust. That's not criminal breach of trust in this case.
Not criminal breach of trust. What I'm trying to say is that they feel that there's a sanctity to the game, which is that it would be played fairly. So I'm not saying for one moment that this is criminal breach of trust or this is cheating for that matter, because it doesn't meet the offense of cheating under the IPC either. But I'm saying even under a hypothetical new law, is this something that can be considered as grave or serious enough to be treated as a crime simply because spectators sort of pay money and go to watch a game in the ground or watch on the television and feel that they've been somehow wronged?
Look, there too. like to address the first thing, that this law is not about just BCCI. This law, which is proposed, is about sports. And if most of the sports bodies, besides the BCCI, are government-controlled bodies. So let us not talk about whether BCCI is what BCCI's standing is. Regarding the applicability of the law, well, if a statute is framed, like in many countries, even in private organization, bribing is an offense. It depends how you frame the law. If it's defined, something is defined as an offense and a law is enacted by the legislature, it would be a law.
The next question is from Matthew McDonough, and he says that criminal prosecution should always be an option. And the reason that he says is that the sporting authorities do not have the powers or expertise in terms of search, seizure, production orders for bank accounts and telephone records, for example. And he says many of these investigations are also international in nature. So does the panel think that international criminal cooperation is essential to any successful anti-corruption effort? I can get Mr. Richardson to respond to this, but I also would like your thoughts in terms of, and again, you've mentioned some of these experiences earlier in terms of how you've dealt with the Australian authorities, etc. But do you find that these authorities being weighed down in any way by having to sort of address questions such as this, in the sense that do they see the justice system itself being, feeling even further burdened by something which might otherwise not be considered as their sort of regular day-to-day domain of functioning?
But the answer to that is in short, no. I think most jurisdictions don't feel burdened because, of course, it's their choice as to whether they actually take something on as an investigation and take it further and put their resources into it. And there will always be a balance between priorities and resources for law enforcement. In the case of Australia, they have specialist units in their states who deal with match fixing. That is their day job, to actually deal with individuals both within sport and outside sport to do with match fixing. And that's what they do. And we get very, very good cooperation from them. Just to take up a couple of points with Matthew from his question, we actually employ some very, very good investigators who are fully police trained and have had many, many years of experience in police services around the world. So they actually do have the experience, they do have the skills and expertise, but of course we do not have the powers that the police do to execute search warrants, monitor phones and that sort of thing. But what we do have under our code for those within the sport, powers to demand from them their bank accounts, powers to demand access to their phones. And these give us similar information to that we would get when we were serving police officers. And we get a lot of information from devices that we seize from players, and also those that we seize from people who are linked to the sport, but not actually on the field. They might be owners, they might be sponsors, they might be people who are less connected, but still participants under our code. Where the problem comes, we do not have the power to go and conduct those sort of investigations on people outside the sport. And that's where law enforcement becomes an essential partnership for us to work with them and to actually keep the sport clean. And in Australia's case, they're very, very proactive. And if they have the information that warrants it, they'll stop somebody from even coming into their country before a tournament in order to protect that tournament and protect the sport. But I come back to the point I made earlier, that within India, it's not shadowy figures sitting in foreign jurisdictions. It's shadowy figures sitting in India who are responsible for an enormous amount of the fixing in the allegations that we deal with at the ITC. And it would be a game changer for India to introduce match fixing legislation. Of course, there will be challenges with how it's framed, and we've heard some of those. But with the talent that exists in drafting legislation in India, those challenges surely are not insurmountable.
The next question is from Varun, and I think again, Mr. Richardson, you might want to sort of address this as well, and perhaps the other panelists as well, if they have any thoughts on it. And I think this is an interesting question because this might be sort of one of the challenges that we might face going forward, which is, and he wants to know your opinions on fantasy sports being legal but not betting when there's so much overlap. And I'm just wondering whether sort of the commencement of these fantasy sports leagues online presents a different kind of challenge to the one that you might have faced from traditional betting circles, and whether that needs addressing in the law.
Fantasy leagues are something that we come across frequently. They are not a problem for us. Fantasy leagues are a fun game for people to indulge in. Where it becomes a problem for participants within the sport is when people, sometimes with very good intentions, contact the players on social media to ask them, are you playing tomorrow? What's the team tomorrow? That then becomes a problem for the player because they are not allowed to divulge inside information. And of course, they have no idea whether it's for a fantasy game or whether it's for real betting. But it puts them in a very difficult position because if they pass that information on, then it has the potential to breach anti-corruption codes. So whilst fantasy leagues are not an issue for us, we support them. It is a problem only when the players of the game contact players in real life. And certainly at the ICC, we would urge them not to do that because it's risky for the players who are out on the field.
Another question from Rohan Mirpuri is whether it would be advisable to have sport-specific regulations which are strengthened to punish or prosecute activities such as match fixing, as opposed to having a general state-enacted law across sports. Because, I mean, he asks this, which is, he says that the standard of evidence and proof of guilt may not be high as it would otherwise be in the case of public criminal law. I think what he's trying to say is that maybe different sports work differently in terms of how fixing might take place, and whether that is something that a omnibus match fixing law needs to take into account. Would any of the panelists have any thoughts on this?
Look, the law won't go into the nitty-gritty of how it's being fixed. The issue is whether it's being fixed. Now, for soccer, the parameters of fixing may be different. Parameters of fixing for cricket may be different. But the fact is, if fixing is taking place, a single law should be able to deal with it. There shouldn't be an issue about it. And this is a tried law in many countries. They don't have sport-specific laws.
Can I just also add on to that?
Sure.
You see, I'm a little hesitant to accept a case where the standard of proof is reduced. The question seemed to suggest that we should have some in-between law where the standard of proof is not as high as is required in criminal law. I don't think you can tamper with first principles of jurisprudence in this manner. So if you have a law, and if you are seeking to criminalize activities such as this, then the standard of proof must be the standard of proof which is applicable across the board. And lowering of the standard of proof will give rise to another set of problems. So that would be very, very dangerous. I also want to ask Mr. Richardson one question. You seem to suggest that the Australian system is very robust. Does the Australian system also criminalize? Does it have a criminal legislation which can take players and intermediaries to court?
Yes, it does. It can actually, it covers any person. So it covers both players and people outside the sport.
I see. So the two, and again, I'm asking out of ignorance, the two Australian cricketers who were recently banned for a certain period of time, was the criminal justice system invoked in that case?
So I think, are you referring to the female cricketer?
I mean, the former captain and a player.
Those were not for fixing. Those were for.
Oh, I see. So I mean, again, okay. So that was dealt with entirely by the internal regulatory body. I see.
Right. And just to be clear, just because legislation exists, and just because something that a person within the sport does would or could be a criminal offence, it does not mean to say that the police are obliged to take on that. Now, I've had experience in the UK where we actually dealt with two players for match fixing, and the police were given the opportunity to prosecute if they wish to, or investigate if they wish to take it on, and they declined to do so. They were happy to leave it to the governing body of the sport, and I think that approach is to be welcomed. It enables you to have a dual track approach, best of both worlds.
Ayush Manjunath has a question on treating sporting federations such as the BCCI as state and as state bodies. And the reason I think he asks this is because he's perhaps curious about holding the BCCI and other bodies such as the BCCI subject to greater accountability. Now, of course, we know that the Supreme Court has said that the BCCI is not akin to state, but it's still a public body performing public functions. But do we think, or do the panelists have any specific thoughts on whether it needs to be treated as state, so that, because obviously a number of players, who are involved in it. I mean, I don't know if Ms. Rebecca John has any thoughts on that before I move to the next question.
It would be very difficult to bring BCCI within the constitutional definition of state. Very, very difficult. It would be a travesty.
Okay. So I think we can take one more question and then we can close with that. And I'm just trying to scroll through to try and read the questions to kind of pass out what might be relevant. Ritvik Thakur asks, because he says that, as Mr. Richardson states, that in a majority of cases, the flow of money has led to India. But what if the crime is committed outside of India? Let's say the match that is fixed itself is in Australia. So how will the person in India be charged? I mean, he's wondering if it's something that a match fixing law, that an omnibus law needs to take into account, this sort of interplay of movement of money with the place in which the crime is in fact committed, or because this is something that criminal laws of a certain kind might run into problems with. And in terms of application of jurisdiction, what kind of jurisdiction needs to be applied to a match fixing law?
So if I can just deal briefly with that, and to be clear, I wasn't talking about the flow of money per se. I was talking about the individuals responsible for the organising and the approaches. It can be sometimes as simple as somebody contacting the player on social media, transferring that onto WhatsApp and onto phone calls, and grooming them and asking, and then eventually asking them to fix. So it can be as straightforward as that. If we take the case of the three individuals just before Christmas in the UK, as far as the international side of the investigation goes, that was a conspiracy that took place in the UK, predominantly in the UK. However, some of the offences or some of the action on the field, some of it took place in Bangladesh, and the main offence that the individuals were dealt for took place in the UAE. So it is possible to frame a law in a way that just because the final act is abroad, if elements of the conspiracy are taking place within your jurisdiction, it is possible to frame a law carefully and appropriately that would deal with that.
Do any of the other panelists have any final thoughts? Because I think this is all the time that we have. If any of the panelists have any final thoughts, I can just take that.
Can I make a...
Sure, please.
Look, it's very obvious from what we read and get to know that this infiltration of outside elements into cricket is far deeper than what is being presumed, especially if you look at the Karnataka League. there were allegations, there are allegations that the owners of the teams are themselves involved in betting and getting players involved. We know what happened in 2013 IPL, where one of the major owners was involved in betting. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge which I know for a fact that Mr. Mishra, who was investigating the IPL betting scandal, finally realized, he was heading the narcotics in India at that moment of time, that this is not a job which he can do without the help of full-fledged investigation. An investigation in which not just the police powers, but man powers, everything is needed to go deep into this. So these challenges are huge. And despite whatever ICC is doing, whatever Indian board may be doing, are we doing enough? I don't think we are geared up to meet this challenge.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you very much to each of the panelists. I'll hand it back to Shan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the panel for that engaging and lively discussion.